Hi, welcome to Marlene at Home. And I'm Marlene from the Carroll County Public Library, and I work at the North Carroll branch as the Adult Services Supervisor. Today is the 77th anniversary of D-Day. June 6, 1944 was a memorable day in our country's history. Today I want to tell you some stories about my dad and his war buddies on that day, leading up to that day and on that day, and some of the battles that followed after D-Day. The very first thing I want to tell you, and I'm going to do some reading today. If you're watching a library program, you must like books, you must like reading, so I hope you don't mind, but I am going to read some story parts to you. The first story was written by one of my dad's war buddies. His wife took a writing course at a local community college, and her husband would never talk about being in World War II. But a few years before he died, she talked him into doing this so she could do this writing project for her course. And so Ed Hines, one of my dad's war buddies, told his wife his story, and then she wrote it down. And I'm just reading parts of it on excerpts. And he talks about that at Indiantown Gap, not far away from us in Pennsylvania, he worked as an instructor in the carpenter shop. And he says, here I met Willie Davis. Willie Davis is my dad. And so they struck up a friendship and they stuck together all throughout the war. So he says, here I met Willie Davis, who would stay with me until the war was over. Willie Davis was from Chester, Pennsylvania. He married after the war, and his wife still corresponds with us. He died of a brain tumor when his two girls were very young. Fran, his wife, and her two girls, Marlene and my sister Cindy, and their girls, we each had two daughters, and so my mom had 4 granddaughters. We all went out to California. I was on to tell the story. We enjoyed them so much. We had our granddaughters here, and the 6 girls together had a ball. And then in 1985, we visited Fran in Chester, PA, and again we had a ball. And we still hear from Marlene and Fran at Christmas time. Now my mom and Ed and his wife have now passed away, but it's fun to have these written stories. So he talks about being in New York, and this is before they leave the U.S. On a ship to go over to Europe. This is our dad in a small portion of Company A of the 487th Port Battalion of the Transportation Corps. This is in Fort Hamilton, Brooklyn, New York, and after a brief time off with their families, a few days, they then all left on a Liberty ship. I've wondered how many of these men never returned to U.S. soil. Here's my dad on his 3-day leave before departing the U.S. for Europe. He is with his sister and parents. We were there a week or so in a marshalling area. Troops from all over the states were coming into this port and boarding ships for overseas. We boarded a Liberty ship, and what a trip we had. It was stormy, waves were as high as the ship. I was seasick most of the time, Ed said. We were packed into that ship like sardines, bunks 4 high down in the hold of the ship. One morning I woke up feeling pretty good, went up on the deck, had breakfast, lit a cigarette, and that did it. Back to the bunk I was for the rest of the trip. We finally landed in Liverpool, Scotland, and we unloaded part of the troops, and then we went on to Bristol, England, where we stayed until a few weeks before D-Day. Here, with my crew, Willie Davis and others, we built a camp, barracks and a carpenter shop where Ed was in charge. They let me choose someone to work in the shop with me, and I chose Willie Davis. He was a good worker and a great guy. We repaired crates that were damaged in shipment and any maintenance needed. We were there 8 or 9 months, dodging buzz bombs and V-bombs. From here, we were sent to Tony Pandy, which is in Wales in England, to prepare for the invasion of France. We stayed in private homes there, and I stayed with a really nice family. The lady of the house even wrote to Jen after I left. And now we're going to switch to another book. A number of years ago, about 2009, my niece Christy said to me, could you tell me about Pop-Up? Could you tell me about who Ed's calling Willie Davis? Where was he in the war? What outfit was he with? And so I did some, librarian research, and I found this book that was written by Brian Morris, A Moment in History, the story of the American Army in the Rhondda in 1944 in Wales. And so I read about this online. I ordered it. I ordered my sister a copy. We bought them. And I was just so amazed when I read this book because it was all about the American soldiers that stayed in the Rhondda Valley, and I'm not even sure I'm pronouncing that correctly, but my dad stayed in the little town of Tony Pandy. Here's my dad at 21 years old, his first time overseas. He lived with a Brewer family. It was an older couple. They had no children. He and another guy lived there, but right around the corner from them, or maybe they shared backyards, were the Derrick family that were younger and had children, and that's where my dad and a lot of the servicemen just seemed to gather to that home. My dad said he was one of the few guys that really felt at home there because they did not have indoor plumbing, they had outhouses, and my grandparents, as I've said before, never had electricity, and so my dad felt like there was no change in life for him, no running water, outhouses, that kind of thing. And this book was written all about that time when the Americans were staying in that area in Wales. And Brian Morris, then he sent us books and he dedicated, he says, to Marlene, in memory of your father, William L. Davis Jr., formerly a member of the 184th Port Company, 487th Port Battalion, who served his country with pride in the Second World War. William was billeted with the Brewer family and was befriended by the Charles Derrick family in Tony Pandy. And so I just want to read you a little bit of Brian Morris's story when he was 8 years old. In 1944, I was 8 years old and living at 9 Gilfetch Road in Tony Pandy. 2 American soldiers were billeted with my neighbors, Mr. and Mrs. George Smith. We shared a communal backyard with outside water taps. As an 8-year-old, I was fascinated with these Americans, and every evening I would sit on the stone steps and talk to them and watch them clean their equipment. When this was done, they would wash and prepare themselves to go out for the evening. But suddenly, to my great disappointment, one morning, they were gone. They had received early orders in the early hours to report to their depots by 6 p.m. to move out of the area. Later that morning, Mrs. Smith came around to my house with a large parcel. They had left some presents, quote, for the kid next door. There was a letter to me, an old Moore cigar box full of candy and gum, a pair of gaiters, a side cap, a helmet, and a U.S. Army Bible. In the cover of the Bible was written, presented to, then my name, address, the date, June 1st, 1944. These items I value greatly, and I have them to this day. And he has a small picture, which you won't be able to see. We don't have this in our library. This was a small private book that was published in Wales, but you can get it on Amazon. He says, 50 years later, in 1994, great preparations were in hand to celebrate the successful D-Day landings in Normandy. Commemorative editions were promised in the local press, and I hoped to learn something about the American presence here in the Rhondda in 1944. But I was to be disappointed. There was no mention of them at all. There had been such a strict wartime security that nothing about them had been recorded. He asked around at some senior centers, and not only had they been there in large numbers, but they had been billeted throughout both of the Rhondda valleys. They were well remembered and with great affection, and I resolved to try and uncover the events of those days, and my research revealed a unique story. This book is based on memories of the people who lived through those historic times. It could not have been told without the generous cooperation of local people and former GIs and their families, to whom I am most grateful. This is their story, and one they did not wish to disappear unrecorded. I never knew anything about my dad in his years at Tony Pandy, but I did know of the Derricks and the Brewers through mail. They always sent my sister and I birthday gifts, Christmas gifts. I have Christmas ornaments on our Christmas tree that I have shown at Christmas time from them. My sister and I both had like Santa mail bags that was hung on my mother's mantle corners every year that held us kids' Christmas cards. Special things, letters, we always recognized their handwriting right away. It was kind of a backward slant to their writing. It was beautiful. And so we have fond memories of these dear people that took my dad in, loved him like a son, and stayed in touch with my mom, my grandmother, and us girls for many, many years. And so this is the book about that. And the very first paragraph of the book was, he says, writing to Mr. and Mrs. Derrick on Charles Street, Tony Pandy, that's the same home my dad visited, the friends next door, with whom this man that was writing was billeted before going overseas. He said that to keep fresh in the minds of the Americans who stayed in Tony Pandy, they wanted the excellent treatment that they had received while they were there, and called one of their trucks the Tony Pandy Special. And they said they wanted everybody in the Tony Pandy area to accept the American soldiers' sincere good wishes and thanks. And Brian Morris, excuse me, asked me if my dad was artistic. And I said, yes, he was. Why do you ask? And he said, well, because this other man that says he also lived with, or stayed at the Derricks, he had a friend that was artistic and drew the picture of the Jeep on the front cover. Brian Morris thinks that that man was my dad. We don't know for sure, but when I look at all the things in my home growing up that my dad made and painted and drew, I can believe it. And so here's a picture of the Tony Pandy Special Jeep, and a picture of it that may have been, what do I want to say, made by my dad, created by my dad. All right, back to Ed and his story. Early on the morning of June 6, 1944, we sailed for France. Our ship loaded with gasoline was in the spearhead and behind the infantry and artillery troops. So I know from other accounts, paratroopers landed first, then behind them came the infantry and the artillery. Then my dad was in the transportation company in Ed and moving all the things that the men on the ground now needed to be able to progress forward. So my dad was in the very early stages on the beach at Normandy on that day. More than 2 million American and British troops were massed in the British Isles for the Great Attack. 16 million tons of arms, munitions, and equipment were stored up and ready and waiting. 4,000 ships and landing craft, including 60 types built especially for the invasion, were on hand. 11,000 planes were ready to give protection overhead. Infantrymen stormed the Normandy beachhead after dropping from the bows of invasion barges. They crouched under the weight of a full pack and rifles as they waded waist deep in the rough waters of the English Channel toward the enemy positions on shore. Our boat, we anchored offshore behind the fighting troops and was supplied the fuel. It was in 5-gallon cans, 2 strapped together. A pilot boat would come by and tell us how much to load on each amphibious barge. I had one of these in each hand when a bomb landed close to our ship. The ship lurched and I hurt my back. From then on, they let me run the winch, which was used to unload other ships. Ships were coming in continuously with supplies for the troops. There were large helium balloons on wires, and they were attached to our ships and floated above us, so the German planes couldn't come down and strafe us. Many of the balloons caught fire, and there was burning above us. Big artillery guns behind us were firing over our heads at the German fortifications on the ridge above. More fireworks than any 4th of July. The whole sky was ablaze. I wasn't enjoying this scene any. Just praying I would live to tell about it. Bombs were falling all around us on that day. I was sleeping next to a 50 caliber machine gun and it was firing constantly. Every third one was a tracer so the gunman could set his sights on the plane. One night he brought a plane down right next to our ship. The coastline was fortified with barbed wire, landmines, and concrete pillars. Above on the ridge were what we called pillboxes. They were the square building of cement, 12 feet thick walls and roofs. On the side were slots 2 or 3 feet long for their guns. They were firing at our troops as they landed. Our troops advanced with bulldozers. The blade held up in front to protect them from enemy fire. The infantry followed with hand grenades that they threw into the slots of the pillboxes. A German 88 gun was firing from a cannon above the ridge. The pilot boat came to give us a message and was hit with one of those shells and blew up right beside us. If it hadn't been there, it would have hit our ship, loaded with all that gasoline. After we got ashore, I went up and I got the firing pin from that gun, and Ed says, I still have it. And so that's some of the things that happened to my dad and to those men right there. He says, when the infantry got the Germans pushed back about a quarter of a mile, my crew and I went ashore to establish a camp. We built a Quonset mess hall and a recreation room out of shipping crates and canvas and wire mesh. We slept in pup tents, 2 men in a tent, and it rained for 30 days out of the first 31. What a mess. I built a little shack out of crates with culverts as roof for a few of us. We gathered discarded life jackets and made mattresses. You can imagine where those discarded life jackets came from. We had it pretty good compared to those guys in the pup tents. Trenches were 6 or 8 feet deep or dug, and I built toilets over them, and we called them 20-holers. Our showers were our helmets of the ocean. A large trench was dug to bury the dead. The burial crew went along in a truck and stacked the bodies on like cordwood. They were laid in the trench side by side and covered over. It took several days for us to pick them all up, and the stench was so terrible, sometimes we couldn't eat. Later, they were dug up and transferred to a cemetery further in line. After our troops had recaptured Paris, we weren't so busy on the beach. Willie and I drove a truck with approximately 20 men in it to spend the day and the night there. The round trip took us about 15 hours. We would leave early in the morning with a load, leave them, bring the load back that we had left the day before. We never got to spend a day or a night in Paris, though. And so we'll come back a little bit later to some more things there. But I wanted to show you, my grandmother saved the headlines to my local newspaper in the hometown that I grew up. Europe invaded, Allied armies gain footing in France, and it's dated the late edition, a special night extra edition on Tuesday, June 6th, 1944. And so that was the headline, and this is just one section of the paper, and it's very thick. Lots of stories and last minute news on that. During the time building up to the war, my dad, up to D-Day, my dad would send my grandmother these little, they were called V letters, and so I pulled the last one out, a V mail, I'm sorry. They were all addressed, they were always addressed to my grandmother, Mrs. Willie Davis, and here was the little note that he wrote just days before D-Day. Dear Mom and Dad, just a few lines to let you know I'm okay, and I do hope you're the same. Charlie and Butch, 2 men from his hometown, are as fine as ever and send their regards. I guess you're wondering about me not writing more often, but to tell the truth, I really don't have much time. I'm still in a private home, so he's in Tony Pandy, but I really don't have much time. I'm still in a private home that I told you about before. They took me to a party last night, and I was treated like a king or something better, because this was near the time of his birthday. The people around here treat you so swell. They are a lot like the people around home. Well, I have to close this letter, and I have some more work to do. Take care of yourselves. Give my love to all. I hope Dell is coming okay. That's a cousin. And give her my love, also to Nain, another cousin, Anna, his sister, and to all the rest. Goodbye for now, William. All of the letters were signed William or your son William. My mother never called my dad William, but his mother always did. Friends called him Willie, Bill. But anyway, it's fun to read these emails from my dad. All right, we're going to stop for a second and change locations. I'm standing by a shadow box that my youngest daughter made me a number of years ago with things from my dad, things from the war. I've got his dog tags, there's some pictures of him, newspaper pictures of D-Day. My dad was on the Normandy beaches. It was called Fox Beach Green or Green Fox. There's a picture of he and his family. That was the last time he was home in April before he left for Europe. Some of his awards. And so he was in almost all of the major battles in Europe. These are some memories of D-Day when my dad served on Fox Green Beach in the first 30 minutes on the Normandy beach in France. My youngest daughter made me this memory box that has my dad's awards and dog tags, and towards the bottom is a picture of my mom and dad before they were married. And I'll just read a little bit more from Ed Hines' account. After they left Paris, he says our next move in December was to Liège, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, Belgium, on the Meuse River. It was so cold there that the icicles hung from the roof to the ground, 8 or 10 inches in diameter. We had barracks there we stayed in, 4 to a room. The center was a pot-bellied stove with our 4 army cots around it. We took turns during the night keeping the stove red hot. Our canteens on the other side of the cots were frozen solid in the morning, and we would have to thaw them out on the stove. Our company then unloaded supplies on the river where it was hauled to the front lines during the Battle of the Bulge. And my dad got awards for being in the Battle of the Bulge and different things that happened to him there. On December 16, 1944, the German army struck in the Ardennes forest where lines were thin and lightly held, and my dad had the good fortune of being in that area when that happened. The Germans soon surrounded and then pushed on toward the Meuse River. American tank forces cut through the German lines to relieve them. The German advance was stopped just short of the Meuse, and within a week the Allies had regained all the ground lost in this offensive. They then pushed on into the Rhineland and fought against heavy German opposition. From there, we went to Antwerp, Belgium, on the coast of the North Sea, and Willie and I built a carpenter shop on the docks. At night, trucks would pick us up and take us to camp. One evening, a few days later, we were at a camp when the truck came with another load of men and told us our shop, where we worked almost daily, had just been blown up. We were sure glad that we were on the first load to camp, or we would have been in it. We had to rebuild it. We built cabinets, we repaired crates, and we did maintenance work. We also had 8 or 10 German war prisoners working for us, and since I could understand German and talk some, that worked out pretty good for us. We had them doing all the heavy work, and we were the overseers. There were 2 MPs with guns guarding them at all times. Willie and I were invited to have Christmas dinner on a ship we were unloading, and that was a lucky thing for us because back on our ship, our camp cook forgot to remove the entrails from our Christmas turkeys, and he cooked them, guts and all. One evening, a bunch of our guys was going into town to see a play, and Willie and I were tired, and us 2 decided to stay in camp. Besides, I don't really care for plays. A bomb hit the theater, and several of our men were killed and many injured. We had to build coffins for them. This was another time I was thankful I stayed in the camp. And so there's more and more stories like that and the battles that both my dad and Ed were together in. But finally came this headline, that the war in Europe is over. And this was Tuesday, May 8th, 1945. And so that was wonderful news to the world. And although the war continued for another 6 months in Japan, I think it's 6 months, might have been a little longer. But some of my favorite things are, my grandmother had a calendar, and on the back she would write all the dates, when my dad was inducted, when he left, when he came home for 3 days, like when that picture was taken with his family, and when he was in this country, or when she got mail from England, or Belgium, or Germany, or the North Sea. And then on November 26th, the very last line, 1945, it says, and in my grandmother's handwriting, so it's very precious to me, reached home in Ogden, safe, thank God. And so that was very special to have that piece from my grandmother. I've always loved that. And then that was Thanksgiving, and just a month later, my grandmother got a card, and it's a beautiful kind of painting card, and it says it was made in Great Britain, but it came from Wales, from the Brewer family. And handwritten, it says, wishing you all the best, Mr. and Mrs. Davis, 1945, from Mr. and Mrs. D. Brewer. And that's the family where my father stayed with while in Wales and while the troops were hiding there. And one of the things in Brian Morris's book that he mentioned was there were no pictures taken. None of the soldiers were allowed to take pictures or draw pictures of where they were. There were no movies, there was no newsreels allowed because they were trying to hide these men. That's why they didn't build barracks. They were hiding them in with the townspeople so that the Nazis would not know of the big military buildup that was happening. And of course, the Nazis were very shocked by the D-Day invasion. So that was just some memories from my dad and his war buddies related to D-Day on this 77th anniversary. Here's a newspaper clipping from a local paper that my grandmother saved, And it is the battle for Fox Beach, where my dad was the first 30 minutes of the invasion. And I love seeing her handwriting where she writes, where William L. Davis Jr. landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944. Then at the bottom is part of the calendar that I talked about where she would record the dates and where my father was on different dates when she received mail from him. But my very favorite line is from November 26, 1945. Reached home in Ogden, safe, thank God. This is Cindy and I after the war with our dad and his parents. In the next year, my Pop-Up Davis and my dad passed away, and within 6 months of each, my mama lost her husband and her son. Two funny stories I thought I'd share with you on a lighter note here. I was reading one of my favorite books. It's a children's book. It's called Snow Treasure. And I was reading it to my two grandsons, and it's about children in Norway that hid the gold bullion from the Norwegian banks on their sleds and took it down the mountains and got it to the sea, and the gold bullion was able to get out of the country and came and was safely held in New York. And so I'm reading this children's story to them, and they're so into it, and they don't want to go to bed at night, and they're really asking a billion questions. But anyway, I was reading it to them this winter, and the next morning before I awake, or how I awake, is that my oldest grandson stands over the bed and he says to me, "Mama, does this mean that your dad knew Nazis?" And he was like, "Your dad knew Nazis?" Because I had said my dad was a soldier in World War II and was, in these different countries. And so he was all worried, thinking that my dad knew Nazis. But then Josiah, he comes in later that day, and that's my kindergartner, and he says, "Mama, was there a World War I?" And I said, "Oh, yeah." He said, "Then, Mama, you should have told us about World War I before World War II, because when you watch the Harry Potter movies, you have to watch Harry Potter 1 before you watch Harry Potter 2, Mama." Like, "Mama, come on." And it was really funny. On the first Memorial Day after our dad passed away, Cindy and I are here at his grave. Speaking of children, here is an amazing picture of my dad on the left and my sister's oldest grandson, Kyan Davis Milligan. His middle name is after my dad. Both are the same age, 11 years old. Can you see the amazing resemblance of my dad and his great-grandson? Once again, thank you for joining me at Marlene at Home. I've really enjoyed being with you, and I look forward to having you again. One of my favorite books on World War II is The Greatest Generation by Tom Brokaw. I highly recommend that you look for it in the library. Tonight, Old Glory is flying high on my front porch. Long may she wave as we remember the 4,400 who gave their lives on D-Day 77 years ago.